introduce our last speaker, Bryan Birch, who will tell us about his memories about working on EDSAC 2.
Okay, well, thank you. I thought I'd start off with a list of relevant people. I should explain that I'm completely incompetent at computer technology for lecturing. So Gemma is showing some slides for me as I go along. The first slide, the first 6 names are the academic staff of the computer laboratory in 1989. And then there are 4 names of people who were very relevant for our original paper. Davenport and Castle, you know. Gina, we dedicated the second note to for good reasons, which I'll explain. And Nelson Stevens, I added because he was the guy who gave the first honest evidence for the conjectures when the number of generators is strictly positive. Now, another thing I should remark, I'm reminiscent about 60-year-old memories. They're all completely truthful memories, but memories that old for the sort of Chinese whisper phenomenon, and they gradually change as time goes on, so they're not completely reliable. Okay. I first met Peter in 1953, but it wasn't until about 1966 to 7 that I really knew him. At that stage, we wrote a couple of papers together, and he taught me to love opera. And my earliest clear memory is sitting on his sitting room floor, listening to Callas singing Casta Diva. Then, for the year 57 to 58, I went to Princeton. And while in Princeton, I came under the influence of Andre Weil, just as Peter had about 4 years earlier. And I returned to Cambridge in 1958 to find Peter in the computer lab. Now, the thing which they was very enthusiastic about was the Tamagawa number. And Peter and I wondered whether there might be some analog of a Tamagawa number for elliptic curves. So I signed on as one of the users of EDSAC 2. Now, the EDSAC lab, I think, was the happiest place I ever worked in. It was intensely exciting because there were lots of people doing something which was completely new. People were rather special. It was very informal. Everyone talked to one another using first names, which on the whole was not something one used to do 60 years ago. And there are only about 3 rules I can remember. The first rule were, of course, fire precautions. The place was a potential fire trap. The second one was also obvious, no drinks near the machine. And the third rule was that when the machine was running, there had to be an authorized user in charge who knows how to turn it off, because if you turn it off in the wrong way, there are electrical surges which destroy it. And the authorized user really, while they were in charge, they really had to watch it. Now, basic facts. This is the standard picture of EDSAC 2. The machine, the computer laboratory was in the old Corn Exchange, which was a great big building. And the EDSAC 2, the machine, was in a very large room, I think on the first floor up. The machine was in the middle, and then there were shared offices all the way around, except for one corner, which faced over the Cavendish laboratory, had a big window and an alcove, and this picture is a picture of the program testing queue, with lots of people on the right holding little tapes which they're going to test, and Gina on the left, who's in charge, and she's feeding tapes into the machine. Now, elsewhere in the building, there's a big room, rather similar to this one, where Triton, the next machine after this one, was being built. And then there are all the usual rooms you expect to see, like a lecture room and offices and workplaces for lots of users and research students, various people, facilities for the engineers, and very important, a room wherein one prepared tapes and read them and copied them. The number who are actually paid to be staff of the computer laboratory they're really rather few. There are only the 6 academics. I noted at the start, not nearly enough to do all the teaching. I assume that they were supplemented by people on various sorts of grants and research students, and that was the case for most subjects in Cambridge at that time. And it probably still is. There's an awful lot of the teaching is done by the research students. Yes, all the academics had other jobs as well. Eric and Margaret Much, they were in charge of the administration and did a lot of teaching. In fact, they all did a lot of teaching. David Wheeler had devised the language for EDSAC 2, and Peter was working on preliminary proposals for the language that Triton would speak. Later on, he was joined by lots of other people working on the software for Triton. But Miles Reed told me that when he was a student, the legend was that the autocode had been designed by Peter, and I'm pretty certain that that must have been true. Besides the academics, there are half a dozen or more engineers, either maintaining EDSAC 2, which needs a great deal of maintenance, or building Triton. And there were several operators. Those were girls trained as authorized users, the ones whose principal job was to run the machine. Of course, like everyone else, they had lots of other jobs which they took turns doing. There was the largest contingent of research students and postdocs, and there were very, very many users and would-be users from other faculties. Some of the users spent most of their working hours in the laboratory. It was their principal place of work. The criterion for who should be allowed to use the machine was rather hopeful. The principle, though the practice wasn't really quite possible, was that every member of the university should be allowed to try to use the machine, but they had to write their own program. And when they got a decent program working, they could apply for more time to actually run something useful, and then there's a committee which decided what they should be allowed. The working day would always start with the engineers serving the machine, and then once it was working properly, it would be handed over to the operators, and the rest of the working day would be divided between the production slots for various users and a few testing sessions like the one illustrated. And slots would be allotted according to priority, and I guess the priority would probably be decided by the amount of research funding which the applicant could pass over to the lab. But also people with low priority would also have time, but they would be given evening slots after the engineers had gone home, so that there would be desirable slots during the day, where the machine would be operated for you by operators, and there would be engineers available in case the machine broke down, which was unfortunately fairly probable. And then there'd be out-of-hours slots after the engineers had gone home, which would last until the machine died for the night. And the machine, the half-life of the machine was unpredictable. It could last for anything from half an hour to 6 hours. Gina, she was an extra. She wasn't strictly an operator. She was the engineering laboratory's first computing officer. And she's important because she shared an office with Peter. Peter's office was just round to the left, essentially behind Gina's back, as the picture lies. Peter and Gina, before she joined Peter in his office, they first met when Peter was giving the introductory lecture to new arrivals, when he was interrupted by a scream. Water had come in through the roof and gone straight down Gina's neck. Peter, on the whole, approved, or so he said. He said a dull lecture had been enlivened. Peter didn't object to her being the one who shared his office, but he made sure that she was a member of the engineering faculty. The point was that he was about to make his first foray into university politics. He wanted the council to have postal votes on important issues rather than people who wanted to vote having to attend the debate. And he wanted Gina to have a vote that he could use for his motion if it turned out to be necessary. I think that it wasn't necessary because I think the council thought that was a pretty sensible idea and backed it. Okay. Now, I should say something about the actual computations we did. Not in any mathematical detail, but when I was preparing the lecture, I found some ancient documents which people might find amusing either to look at or at any rate to describe. Thinking back on those years, our computations really went in three phases. There's what you might call investigation, and then there's revelation, and then there's writing up. And I'll explain. Essentially four things we calculated. To start with, in the investigation phase, we were looking at general elliptic curves, and we were trying to relate the rank of the Mordell-Weil group to the value of the zeta function at value of the L function at s equals 1, and we didn't know how to evaluate the L function, so we had to compute the product of the NP over P for primes up to as big a bound as we could manage and see what happened. Now, in the calculation, I should say that Peter and I worked independently of one another, because Peter had a very sensible principle that if that if one person makes a hand calculation, you don't believe it. If two people make a hand calculation independently, it's okay. In a similar way, if a computer gave the answers to a computation and there was just one program, you didn't believe it. You had to wait until two people had programmed the computer, preferably by different methods, and they still got the same answer, then that was plausible. Of course, nowadays computers are much more reliable than that, but at that time, programs did rather often give incorrect answers. Anyway, during the investigation phase, we were calculating the rank of the curve. Well, Cassels had worked out the Selmer apparatus, and the various ways for computing the rank of various curves, and we didn't really find it too difficult to find the ranks of a good provision of elliptic curves. On the other hand, that product was pretty horrible. It wasn't nonsense. If you calculated, if you took an elliptic curve and calculated that product for increasing values of x, it wobbled about in a horrible way, but it wasn't complete nonsense. And by the end of 1959, Peter and I were independently convinced that it really did behave in accordance with our first conjecture. On the other hand, of course, when the rank of the curve was 0, the thing ought to have been tending to a constant, and well, it was showing some signs of settling down, but there was really no telling where it was tending to. Revelation came in the spring of 1960, Castle's been saying, but I think that if you take the curve with complex multiplication, which is underneath what I'm saying, as it were, the curve y squared equals x cubed minus dx, Hecker's proved that the L function is actually a Hecker's zeta function, and Hecker's zeta functions are sensible, decent functions with functional equations and that sort of thing. And then the real eureka moment was when Dunwood came along and said, and they're doubly periodic. And if you try evaluating them at s equals 1, you get a Weierstrass-P function. And Weierstrass-P functions can be evaluated algebraically and are thoroughly nice. And one of the pieces of paper I found while I was preparing it was actually a tutorial from Harold Davenport in his handwriting on how to evaluate Weierstrass-P functions. Well, from that moment, it was wonderful. We had a big family of elliptic curves, and they've got a respectable L function. You could go back in theory, really lovely classical theory, going back through Hecker to Weber and then back in the 19th century, and suddenly we've got a beautiful theory which was much, much easier and totally convincing. So after that, it was the writing up phase, and writing up the second note was actually quite easy. Writing it up, the first note was, well, Peter got really enthusiastic about calculating the rank of EQ, and Castles had shown that Selma 2 is essentially generated by y squared equals binary quartic, where the binary quartic has invariance capital A and capital B. So evaluating Selma 2 is slightly oversimplifying. It's a matter of finding reduced forms for binary quartics and with the correct invariance, and which such that y squared equals that is everywhere locally soluble, and simply enumerating them. So he wrote a really rather wonderful program for doing this. The reason it's rather a wonderful program isn't so much that he got a good method for reducing binary quartic forms. He delved back into the 19th century, and there's an algorithm due to Julia or Julia, according to how you pronounce it. But actually making it work for a large number of curves on the machine was a tour de force, because it's a matter of fitting a program where the amount of data you want to produce is much more than the storage of the machine. However, the algorithm without that constraint was still a good one, and I think is still at the bottom of, well, it's a great grandfather of the algorithm still used for the first step of evaluating the rank. I say that with some trepidation. He calculated about 2,500 curves. So here, if you can see me, is the original computer output of, it's about half the original computer output of about 5,000 reduced binary quadratic forms, which generate the Selma 2 for all the curves with A up to 30, mod A up to 30 and mod B up to 20. And also, of course, so Peter made a very, very good job of that rank. And then we said as little as we possibly could about the details of the product of NP over P, except that it came out right. And fortunately, everyone believed us because of the stuff about the curves with complex multiplication was so convincing, I suspect. Now, the other manuscript I found is one of Peter's original programs. And I show this because I think I think this actually says quite a lot about Peter. One of the things which I found disconcerting was that he could carry an awful lot of mathematics in his head. When most people are thinking about how to do something, they tend to stand in front of the blackboard, rubbing things out and putting other things in. Peter, in my experience, he may have changed when he got older, used to think for quite a long time, and then he'd write out in neat, flowing handwriting a very, very complicated argument. And that sort of shows in that program. When I wrote a program, the sort of construction was the same. It said things like 46F1 and so on. But mine did tend to have rather a lot of corrections and crossings out and so on. And Peter, well, this is exceptional because you can find two alterations on the page, but he was able to do things just straight out like that. Okay. Now, I've been forgetting Gina. How did we actually get round to doing these computations? Our difficulty was that in those days, pure mathematics had very, very little money. So we had very low priority. Could we go back to that nice, the picture of the computer? Lovely, yeah. We had low priority. So that didn't mean we couldn't use a computer. but it meant we could only use the computer after 9 or 10 o'clock at night. Now, there's a little rule I should have mentioned at the start, was that academic staff were not authorized users because they're supposed to have other things to do besides standing or sitting, watching the computer very carefully and listening to its song. The computer had a loudspeaker, which was very important to the people who were in charge of it, because one got used to the song played by a particular program, and so you knew when it was working right. If, of course, the song stopped, that was, the computer had usually broken down, and that was the end of the evening. If it turned into a horrible repetition it had gone into a loop, and you knew you had to turn that program off. You had to take that program off and try something different because it was on the loop. That particular sort of repetitive noise was particularly common during the testing sessions, because a program being tested usually didn't work, and most often it just stuck, but sometimes it went into a loop. Anyway, Peter wasn't an authorized user, so we had to find an authorized user, and Gina volunteered. So Gina was actually present during almost all of our computations, looking after us, basically, which was why we dedicated the second paper to her. But the more important effects, namely, on good evenings, we finish rather late at night. So I used to walk Gina home, as one always did in that sort of time. And we got engaged in November of 1960. Peter took us to the opera. It was Verdi's Macbeth to celebrate, and then we got married the following summer with Peter as best man, as he clearly should be. And of course, that was nothing out of, that was right and proper and nothing out of the way. And a couple of years later, we left because I took a job in Manchester. And when I left, we were one of 7 married couples, with both members of the couple working in the EDSAC lab, which is really quite a large proportion because the stuff at the EDSAC lab wasn't very great. And that is the reason the EDSAC laboratory, I guess, was a very happy place. And I don't know how long I've taken, but that's it. And the left-hand one is a much better picture of Peter. And I've always wondered whether the same phenomenon of everyone marrying one another happened intellectually.
Well, thank you very much for this lovely talk of your memories at working at the Happy Computer Laboratory. You were, in some sense, the first people who did computer dating, so to speak.
Yeah. Yes. Judy Masserman, she was the one of the married couple. She had a baby, and I think she may have been one of the first people who worked remotely while she had a young baby, because I think David Wheeler managed to fix up the telephone calls and so forth, so that she did actually manage to work the computer from home. I could be wrong about that.
Are there any further questions or comments, Bryan?
A message from me, with those who are able, please give my love to Harriet.
We will do that.
Bryan, it's good manners in Cambridge, if somebody says they're from Cambridge, to say which college. So were you also at Trinity?
No, just a minute. I'm sorry, I'm very deaf. I don't quite get what you said.
The answer is yes. Bryan is an honorary fellow at Trinity, and we only make Trinity people honorary fellows.
Right.
Yeah.
Trinity man.
Your story, Bryan, about the opera celebrating reminds me just quite how generous Peter was to research students and taking them down to the opera and treating them to meals afterwards, etc. First thing he said to me as a research student was, "You're going to be learning algebraic geometry, so you'll need to know Italian, so I'll take you down to the opera regularly so you can learn Italian."
Yeah. Well, I mentioned it because I thought other people might have had that sort of experience. Yes.
Well, of course, many of us had the experience. So, you know, some of us went on car trips around Europe with him.
Yeah, well, yes, well, in 1962, I think it probably was, Gina and I had a holiday in Cinque and while we were there, Peter joined us and those back part of the way.
You reminded me, Bryan, and also Miles reminds me of these trips down to Italy and Peter driving, and he would have a paper he was writing, and when one had to stop for one reason or another, he would then take it up and start writing out completely, no corrections, and the paper was written not in one go because it was written at intervals when we had to stop for one reason or another, but it was all written in his immaculate handwriting without any corrections.
Yes, no, on the Cinque Terre trip, I don't remember there being any mathematics involved in that one. It was a good trip. We went to, yeah.
Well, thank you very much for this really lovely talk, Bryan. So let us thank our speaker again. I think Miles And Jean-Louis wanted to say a few words about their memories of Sir Peter.
So of course I'm many years after Bryan. I was an undergraduate supervisee of Peter. I think in my first year we were doing, partial derivatives and whatever they're called, Fréchet derivatives of functions. And, I had a common sense approach that you wrote down a matrix, and Peter encouraged me in this and so on. I imagine that he had about as much contact with the undergraduate syllabus as I nowadays do when I'm giving tutorials. So it was, but in any case, it was, please come at 7:30. And at 7:30 it was, when you're still on the stairs, you hear the question, sweet or dry, meaning sherry. And so, the best sherry, both the very dry Tio Pepe or, something equivalent to that, and the very sweet ones. So, Peter,
Miles, you're missing something. It was sweet, medium, or dry.
I don't remember that so well. So Peter had this set of rooms above the gate from New Court out into the onto the backs, and when he had a sherry party, towards 8 o'clock, he says, "Oh, I have to go to the hall," and he just left 3 or 4 or more undergraduate students in the room, and he told us, "I warn you, any papers marked confidential will be very boring."
Yes. On the New Court gate, I have a genuine memory. One evening, Peter and I were walking on the backs after dinner and talking mathematics. And we didn't notice the porter shutting the gate. So there we were on Trinity backs with the New Court gate shut. With a horrible possibility we'd have to climb out of the backs past through the other gate, then walk round and get in again. However, before we did that, we tried the unlikely expedient of charging the gate and succeeded. The porter, I think, hadn't really put down the bolt properly, and Peter was quite big.
So I can say a few words about Peter writing. First of all, I remember him preparing his lectures in the library in the old department in Mill Lane. So he was in the library and would write everything in perfect handwriting, as you know, for the next day. But another thing I want to say about his writing is when we, okay, this is personal. So I went to Cambridge in 1969-70 for just for a year. In fact, I knew about Castles because I'd seen Castles lecturing in Paris. And so I wanted Castles to be my supervisor for just that year. But Castles was very busy and he handed me over to Peter. And at the time, coming from France, it was very theoretical mathematics, no computing. And so when they told me I should go with Peter, all I knew about him that he had written a paper in which the word computing was in the title. I said, no, I want the theory, but no computing. So anyway, he took me and anyway, so at some point he told me about a topic for research. And I think this is a good story for youngsters. So he gave me this topic for research in 1970. And well, I did quite a few things after that. Sansik and I tried to solve part of it. As usual, he had been very generous with ideas he had not completely developed. So we developed part of it. And in '82, that is 12 years later, I came back to Cambridge for 6 months. So Peter was extremely busy at the time, as usual, being with university politics or possibly Britain politics. But somehow the last day, he invited me to the high table, mythical place for French people. And so he told me an idea he had. And this idea, in fact, was the missing half in what we had been doing over all these years. And so we started writing this paper together. So Peter sent 20 pages, perfect handwriting, on what his contribution. And Sansik and I developed that into 170 pages long paper over a period of three years. And so when the paper was completed, we were quite happy with that paper. And we submitted it to a journal, very fancy journal, which turned it off immediately, saying it was too long. And so Peter said, give me that paper, I will shorten it down to 100 pages. So we said no. And so ultimately the paper was published as we had written it in the French style, which was not exactly his style. And another recollection I have is about something which was mentioned in the EDSAC's talk. So this way of trying to prove that some case resurfaces of the rationals have lots of rational points. So it's a conjectural method, but it builds on some well-known conjectures, and it predicts that there will be many rational points. And when Peter started writing on this, lecturing on this, he gave a lecture in Paris where no one understood a word. It was really quite impressive. There were very specific computations. And so Alexei and I, we worked another 3 years to understand what he was doing. There was something remarkable. For instance, basically he could do things himself. So he didn't need to read papers by others. So one of the things he had done, for instance, was to reprove Tate's duality for abelian varieties of a local field. The fact that A of QP is dual to H1 K hat. He had redone it for elliptic curves. Probably had forgotten this was a theorem, and so he drew it by himself, which involves a lot of tiny computations, especially for the p part. So anyway, so so Alexei and I we worked through this thing he had written in a very, as Bryan said, very somehow antique style, but incredibly powerful. So anyway, so I have really many fond memories from Peter, also of his driving, which I didn't enjoy too much, I must say. He was very, indeed, he was very keen on convertibles. In fact, I remember one summer, there was a summer conference in Poland. When he arrived, he had crossed the whole of Europe in his convertible. And it was just like the British, when as soon as a little bit of sun, they start being half naked in the sun and they turn red. So his face was completely red when he arrived in Poland. So anyway, owe him an awful lot, and I was very happy I met such an extraordinary man when I was young.
Does anyone else have some memories of Peter that they would like to share?
Jean-Louis reminds me of a conference in Rennes where there was a party in the evening with Sarah and Peter and various other people, and wine was drunk, and he drove us back afterwards. And at that stage, he'd forgotten he was in France and sort of drove on the wrong side of the road, and we nearly had a nasty accident as a result.
He suddenly pushed us into drinking. In fact, there was another incident like this when we were in where was it, in Caen. There's a conference in Caen, and Alexei and I were sitting with him, and he pushed us into drinking. So in the evening, Alexei and I went back to our hotel, and we entered the hotel, and we started looking for our room. And somehow there was something mysterious. In fact, we entered the wrong hotel.
Talking of that, I'm happy to report it is bright sunshine and blue sky in Cambridge. So in about 20 minutes,
Good.
the locals here are invited. Right, we are going to join on. We are going to meet outside for the reception. But I'm very glad that the weather has improved just in time to have a celebratory drink in memory of Peter.
So of course it's very regrettable that more people, well, that we couldn't invite the whole conference.
Yes.
But so we will have a small reception with about 15 people, including Harriet, Peter's widow.
Yeah.
So Bryan was supposed to come over, but Trinity are closed for business. So
Yeah.
Trinity couldn't give him a room.
Yes, I mean, it was, and I mean, 12 people was the maximum, was what I was able to negotiate. So, yeah, it is a pity that we can't have a reception, I mean, on a larger scale. Maybe another time. So something that I learned from Peter was during a talk that he gave at some point at the, I think it was also on the Birch-Swinnerton-Dyer conjecture, where he said to be a successful mathematician, one needs to have unorthodox ideas at fairly regular intervals. Well, that stuck with me. I was at the time just finishing my PhD. So. Right, are there any further comments on memories?
Well, actually, there's one thing I want to comment is, so Miles and I were both students together in 1970. And something which is striking is that Peter didn't force us into the direction of the Birch-Swinnerton-Dyer conjecture. In fact, as far as I'm concerned, I think he never told me about it.
What?
Yeah, I mean, I knew it from, you know, from the books, but he never discussed it. Did you discuss it with you, Miles?
No, never. Well, I mean, I did ask him on one or two occasions, but much later. And
Yeah.
he said, yes, it says that if the rank is big, then you tend to get just a few more points in characteristic P. So, you know, nothing at all, you know, just conversational description of it. But that time we ran a seminar on Sayre's book, Call Loco.
Yes.
Which you were very keen on as a Frenchman. And then we ran this Mumford's Red Book.
Yes.
And so there's a strange thing about Peter, which is that he could do all kinds of things in algebraic geometry, but he could not understand a word of the technical language. So he spoke and thought Weil foundations. And, you know, I think there's possibly no one alive now who is actually fluent in Weil foundations. There are times when I tell people that you've got to think of the generic point like this in the Weil foundations way. But, you know, I think it's, I think nobody's even heard of it now.
Yeah, but as I said, when he needed to do something, he could produce it by himself. So
Yeah, yes.
I mean, I can.
this is typical of his cohomology. You see, I mean, he was doing cohomology without knowing, and as many people, but
Yes.
he refused to learn the language.
Yes, I was going to say this. One of the things Peter mentioned once was that I don't know what cohomology is.
Yes, that actually reminds me, when I was a graduate student, Peter only came to the seminar when he was sure that there wouldn't be cohomology mentioned. So,
Yeah, there's a famous quote of him was about the Weil-Chatelet group. This is Weil-Chatelet group, which is something which is a group when you don't expect it. So it is bound to be a cohomology group.
Mm.
Well, I should probably go and get down and see what the preparations for the receptions are doing. So thank you all again, the speakers of today were really nice and interesting talks. Yes, and I mean, I will see the majority of you tomorrow.
Thank you, especially Bryan. It was a very nice talk.
It was.
We really miss you at this reception party. We'll certainly pass on your good wishes to Harriet.
Yes, definitely. So, okay.
Okay.
Well, so if I now close it, I close it for everyone. Is that fine?
Yes. Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.